Hi, I'm Lee Barrett from what had been Lancaster Theological Seminary, now the School of Theology of Moravian University. And this is the last in a series of on the role of religion in the American Revolution, which I've been suggesting over and over again is an important theme, and it's underappreciated in most schooling and in the popular media. I'm going to anticipate the conclusion. We won. And religion had a great deal to do with that. The first question that's been lurking in the background is one that's much debated in the public arena these days. Was America intended to be a Christian nation? Well, if you go back to the 17th century and the Puritan colonies in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, there the answer was yes. In fact, not only a Christian nation, it was intended to be a Reformed Calvinist colony. Each of the colonies were separate. And in the South, the answer would have been, well, sort of. The intent was that North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia would be an Episcopal colony, Episcopal colonies. But when you move to the 18th century and the generation of the founding fathers and mothers, the answer is clearly no. It was intended, the United States was intended to be religiously neutral, so much so that Thomas Jefferson said there should be a wall of separation between church and state. And putting all the past lectures together, the theme that was underlying them was, religiously speaking, one of the motives for the American Revolution was a strong motive, was no established religion. And folk were opposed to established religions for a variety of reasons. One was the fear, if a religion were to be established at the federal level, it would be Episcopalianism. Or that if there had been no revolution, the British monarchy would have imposed Episcopalianism on all the colonies. So you could call this the motive of episcophobia. It's something that's mostly disappeared, but a pervasive fear of Episcopalians. But there were deeper reasons for that fear of an established religion. And those we've talked about in the prior sessions. One was the fear that an established religion would take away the sincerity and genuine nature of religious faith. And that happened both for the folk who supported the awakenings, the revivals, what became evangelicalism, who feared that if the point of Christianity is to commit yourself freely to follow Christ and to have a conversion experience, that wouldn't have been genuine or authentic if it had been coerced by the government, or even if the government had put its thumb on the scales. So no, if you're a Christian, you should commit yourself freely, and that means not because of peer pressure, and not because of governmental influence, and not because you want to fit in or go along to get along. Those things are not free. So they were afraid of indoctrination, they were afraid of socialization. They said, when there's an altar call, when you're in a big revival and there's an altar call, you freely go up. You know you didn't have to. You know that there would be no political or economic repercussions if you didn't. You know that the responsibility is yours and yours alone. So that meant the colonies in a distaste for a state religion. And to put it simply, the problem was they feared that a state religion makes faith inauthentic. Because you're just doing it because the government said to. I mean, imagine if Presbyterianism were established. Number one, there'd be more people here right now. But number two, you'd never know if people were here because they wanted to, or if they were just here because they had to be. So that was one reason. The other came from the Enlightenment, almost the opposite direction, in that people should adhere to a religion because they have thought it through, been rational about it, and reached their own conclusion. They've thought about options, they've thought about the arguments for the religion, the arguments against the religion, they've weighed the data, they've weighed the arguments, and they've decided that it's rational to come to a particular church. So the folk who believed in the power of reason. And again, if you were going to church because the government said you had to, then you weren't necessarily being rational. Maybe you didn't think about it. Maybe you didn't reason it through. And so that motivation was very deep with the Virginians, like Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe. And also, closer to home, Patrick Henry. And in New England, people like John Adams and Samuel Adams. So you put those two things together, either you should be free to responsibly commit yourself to Christ, or you should be free to think this through for yourself and make up your own mind. You put those two things together. There was a large chunk of the population who said, we don't want the government putting its hands on the scales. We want to be uncoerced and autonomous. And those motivations, which were very different. One was a motivation of the heart. You should be free to respond to Jesus in your heart. One was the motivation of the head. You should be free to think for yourself about religious matters. Both of those valorized autonomy, freedom, responsibility for yourself. And that took an interesting turn. It was very interesting to me because I think it's the first time in human history that the United States, when it was formed, and while it was being formed, began to see itself as what they called a redeemer nation. That the United States was unique, it had a special destiny, it had a God-given task in the world, and that task was to be a beacon of free thought and free emotion, especially in religious matters. The Puritans had thought, well, Puritans had the same thing, sort of. We are a special nation in God's providential plan for the world, but that plan is to become a biblical commonwealth, to spread godly living and godly laws throughout the world. So the Puritans had that. But the generation that founded the United States shifted it to, yeah, we have a special mission from God. We are exceptional. We do have a manifest destiny, but it's to spread freedom, especially freedom of religion and freedom of thought. And we should be a beacon to the other nations. And if we get this they called it a holy experiment. If we get this holy experiment right, it will be the envy of the world. First, Europe will look at us and say, oh, that freedom is great. People are being authentically and sincerely religious because they want to be. They're becoming responsible for their religious lives. This is a wonderful thing. And then they thought, first, Great Britain will convert to religious freedom and stop being Anglican. And then France will stop being Catholic. And then the Pope will convert. And then Islam and Hinduism and all the indigenous religions that they didn't know much about, so that the whole world would have religious toleration and religious freedom. That was a grand vision. It was basically religious, and it never went away. We still have that sense of American exceptionalism, that America's different from everywhere else in the world. That in America, religious belief is sincere and freely chosen, and that makes it deeper and more profound. And that's not the way it is with countries that have had an established religion, like Britain, France, etc. And also went along with the notion that because we have religious freedom, our faith is more authentic and therefore more durable, because individuals choose it, and therefore it belongs to them, and they're not going to be superficial about it. It's not going to be an add-on to their lives. It's something deeply embedded in their hearts, so that America is more spiritual than the rest of the world. It's certainly more spiritual than Europe. And the belief was, if you just give people freedom to think and feel about religious matters for themselves, religion will prevail, and Christianity will win, because it's the best. People just need to think about it freely. And therefore, the United States, unlike other nations, will never be secular. Americans are unusually spiritual in a way that Europe, with its established religions, is not. I had a friend who, in Europe, actually in Denmark, who was commenting on this, and said, you know, you Americans, you think you're never going to be secular. You're always going to be religious. I said, but I got news for you. We thought that too. And now we have like 10 people who go to church on a Sunday in Denmark. So it's not that you Americans are uniquely spiritual. It's just that you're slow. There's a culture lag caused by the Atlantic Ocean, and sooner or later, your churches are going to decline, and you're going to realize you're no more spiritual than anybody else. And sadly, that's kind of coming true. But that notion that we have a special destiny, and it's given to us by God. We have a task to perform. We should be a city on a hill, a beacon to the nations, was ingrained in the very founding of the country. And it had a lot to do with religious freedom. That we've got religious freedom and the rest of the world does not. And religious freedom will make us stronger and better. And religious freedom meant more than toleration, because a lot of European countries had religious toleration, meaning they had an established religion, like in England, Anglicanism, the Episcopal Church. But they'd tolerate others, meaning they wouldn't kill them, they wouldn't lock them up anymore, they wouldn't burn them at the stake, they wouldn't penalize them much, but there would be some unfortunate consequences for them. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, would still have to pay taxes that paid for the Anglican Church. But they could survive, and that included Baptists and Presbyterians, and eventually even Catholics. But that was toleration. Religious freedom was different. It was, no matter what you are, there's going to be no penalties. There's going to be no negative repercussions for you. You won't have to pay taxes that support a church that you don't belong to and don't even like. You will be able to vote and hold public office. You'll have all the rights of everybody else. So it was be an even playing field. It took a while for that notion to catch on because it was radical. And some of the colonies didn't like it and kept their colonial established religion. Like Massachusetts and Connecticut stayed congregational. And tax dollars supported the Congregational Church and no other church. But the other colonies said, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. Let's get rid of an established religion. And eventually, even Connecticut and Massachusetts caved. A consequence of all this that we haven't talked about, which I find to be kind of interesting, but I have quirky interests, was the way in which these religious sensibilities caused splits and divisions within religious traditions, within denominations. And of course, the big split was, are you going to support the king and parliament, or are you going to support the revolution and the Continental Congress? And that divided folk. Every denomination had trouble with that one. I'm going to go down some of the more important case studies that were kind of dramatic. let's start with you folks, Presbyterians. I've touched upon this before. Most Presbyterians, particularly around here, particularly if they were Scotch-Irish descended, were supporters of the Revolution and were very quick to renounce allegiance to the king and Parliament. And that was largely because they had been lied to so much by the monarchy. First, being told that, oh, there's free land in Ireland. So you don't like Scotland that much. Why don't you just move to Ireland? There's this free, fertile, wonderfully productive land. And so they do. And a bunch of Scots moved to Ireland, Northern Ireland, Ulster, with place names like Derry. And what they discovered was the monarchy forgot to tell them that there were Catholics there, and that they were actually intruding upon their land. It was like Israelis with Palestinians. And the Catholics didn't like them, and they engaged in exterminating brutal warfare. So the Scots-Irish had a long folk memory that we don't like the monarchy that deceived us. And then it happened again with Pennsylvania. Said, oh, you don't like Ireland? Well, let me tell you, there's this wonderful place called Pennsylvania. It's run by Quakers. They're tolerant. They'll love you. Just go there and you can have free land around here. And of course, they got here and discovered, oh, they forgot to tell us about the Native Americans and the French Canadians and the Jesuit priests. And that blossomed into the French and Indian War and Pontiac's Rebellion. So the Scotch-Irish had reasons to really dislike Britain, and around here they did. And as you all know, one of the early pastors of this church, John Elder, he was known as the fighting pastor because he would mobilize militias to join the Continental Army and join Washington at Boston, where Washington was still blockading Boston at that time. And another episode, pretty close to here in Mount Joy. You ever hear of the witness tree? Yeah, that was again a Presbyterian church in Mount Joy, in which the congregation, not the pastor, who was kind of moderate and lukewarm about the revolution, but the congregation of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians was on fire for the revolution, went outside after worship, gathered around an ancient oak tree, and all took an oath to oppose the British monarchy. In fact, they took an oath, a covenant. That's a big word in Presbyterian circles, covenant about everything. They covenanted with one another to oppose the British monarchy and kill the monarch if they ever got the chance. These were tough Presbyterians, not the kind you'd want to mess with. I preached at their church a few years ago, and I mentioned that. I said, you folk had in your liturgy an oath to assassinate the monarch of England? And an elder in the congregation looked at me and said, what do you mean we used to? I just sent a message to then Queen Elizabeth and tell you, don't come to Mount Joy. It's not going to be pretty. However, there were Presbyterian loyalists, Presbyterians who remained loyal to England and fought for it and joined as a sort of auxiliary troops of the British Army. They, however, were not Scotch-Irish. They were Scottish, right from the Highlands of Scotland, and had migrated mostly to the Carolinas after there had been a rebellion in Scotland against England. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in this, is the main theme in the series Outlander. And the Scots got defeated at the Battle of Culloden. There was a big slaughter of Scots. The ones who remained took, in order to save their lives, took an oath to be loyal to the British monarchy. And as Presbyterians can be pretty stubborn about keeping oaths. and keeping covenants. So when they came to the United States, settled in the Carolinas, and the revolution broke out, they said, well, we lost one revolt against the British, and then we took an oath never to do that again. And that oath is binding. We cannot break an oath made to God. So I guess we have to remain loyal to George III, and we will, if we fight, we will fight on behalf of Britain, not the colonies. And that actually caused the first battle of the American Revolution. It wasn't Lexington and Concord. It was a bridge in North Carolina where some Scots-Irish, who were also living in North Carolina, tried to seize ammunition as they, for the Continental cause, and were opposed by the Scots Highlanders, who fought for England. And the Scotch-Irish won, actually, chased away the Scots. But that was like a Presbyterian civil war between the Scots proper and the Scots-Irish. And the Scots had this strong sense that oaths are inviolable, you must keep them at all costs, and they continued to maintain that throughout the American Revolution. Many of them retreated into the hills of North Carolina and remained kind of separate and isolated from everybody else, because they thought, well, our Scotch-Irish neighbors have been shooting at us, and just because we want to keep our oaths to George III, and let's get out of here and go up into the mountains. And many of them spilled over into Tennessee and Kentucky. I'm filled with trivia. But anyway, that's another offshoot of the American Revolution and its religiosity. Another strange phenomenon were the Quakers around here. Of course, for starters, they were pacifists. So they didn't want any war at all. And most of them tried to remain neutral, not take sides, not fight for anybody. They were often persecuted for that by the Pennsylvania colony once the revolution got going. But some became loyalists and did join the British Army. And I'd say, so why would a Quaker do that? Well, it was because they feared that if the Americans won, the colony of Pennsylvania might establish a religion that excluded them. And they already felt, well, we've been living under British rule for a long time, and they haven't hurt us, so we really don't think they're going to establish Episcopalianism. We think they're going to continue to tolerate us. So you can trust the British, but the revolutionaries, we're not sure. Who knows? The Presbyterians might get together and establish Presbyterianism. They've attacked us once before when they marched on Philadelphia. See, you can't trust Presbyterians. So let's remain loyal to the king, because we know we will be tolerated with him. And one of the people who did that, he wasn't a Quaker, was Benjamin Franklin's son, who was at the time governor of the colony of New Jersey. And he broke with his father and said, look, I don't trust these people in New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey, so that's wise. I don't trust them. If they get power, they might persecute us. They might persecute the Quakers, and we're better off. It's a safer bet to stay with England. So particularly young Quakers joined the British Army, thereby violating their pacifism. And when the war was over, they had trouble getting readmitted to their meetings, their congregations. Usually they did, but they had to do penance and promise to never do that again, never join an army, take an oath on that, and then they were usually readmitted. So you have this odd phenomenon of Quaker loyalists Actually, my ancestors were among that group. They, at one time, and I'm not bragging because, as you'll see, there's nothing to brag about. My ancestors owned a big chunk of New Jersey, Monmouth County. And they, being Quaker, backed the British. Bad move. When the British retreated from Philadelphia through New Jersey, fought the Battle of Monmouth, and then kept going to New York City. Of course, the Continentals took over the county and confiscated all my ancestors' property, all of it, much to my family's chagrin, needless to say. However, it turned out that through a survey in the 1970s, that there were some pieces of land that had not been claimed by anybody and didn't seem to belong to anybody. So the government of New Jersey, or the government of Monmouth County, told my parents that it was still theirs because it hadn't changed hands. So my mother was just wild with joy and said, you know, this is our ancestral property. Let's go look at it. So we did. It was a swamp. and it had industrial runoff, and the water was iridescent and it glowed in the dark. But she kept saying, all this will be yours one day. And the next thing that we learned was that we owed back taxes from 1781 on. So my mother took the money she had saved for my college and spent it on paying back taxes. And we still have the swamp. Anyway, that was just a digression of how these religious matters disrupted ordinary family life, and in some instances still do. Another interesting group were the Moravians, for whom I work. My seminary is part of Moravian University now, so I'm learning a lot about Moravianism. They were quasi-pacifists. They thought it was okay to use violence to defend yourself. So in the American Revolution, they tried to remain neutral unless they were attacked. And then they said if you are attacked, you can use violence to defend yourself, but don't shoot to kill. Aim for the knees. So if you're attacked by the British or by the Americans, and they're coming and they're attacking Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or Emmaus, Pennsylvania, or Lidditz, aim for the knees. Now the problem with that is, I don't know if you ever fired a musket. You can't aim. You know, the ball just rolls down the barrel, and when it leaves the barrel, it goes in any direction it feels like. So aiming is stupid. Rifles, however, have those grooves that make the ball spin and go straight. So you can aim with a rifle, but not with a musket. Almost everybody was armed with muskets because they were cheaper to produce and not as cumbersome and difficult to load as a rifle. But the Moravians realized, oh, if we're supposed to not shoot to kill, we have to aim at the knees. We need rifles and not muskets. So Bethlehem, Pennsylvania became the main supplier to the Continental Army of the famous Pennsylvania long rifle, which was rifled. So you had these folk who were quasi-pacifists becoming the main ammunition supplier of the Continental Army with long rifles. They also had a factory in Lancaster that made long rifles, and it was run by Moravians. And Moravians prospered and kind of became rich on the arms trade. Because their people needed it, because they said, well, gee, we've got to aim. It's a religious duty to aim. I guess we need guns that will aim. Some Moravians did join the Continental Army because they weren't attacked by anybody. But after Washington's defeat at Brandywine and his abandonment of Philadelphia, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania became the main hospital center for the Continental Army. So Moravians welcomed wounded Continental troops, turned over their churches and made them into hospitals. And so the Moravians thought, well, this is getting kind of close to us. Maybe it is time to declare, and since it's the Continental Army that's winning and they're here, and we're taking care of them, we're feeding them and tending their wounded, I guess we should be sympathetic to their cause. So a lot of Moravian young men did join the Continental Army. And that brings us to the next group, the Episcopalians. And that's a sad story, because they were established in the South. So you would think that they would be pro-British. Except they weren't. Just think, all the founding fathers from Virginia were nominal Episcopalians. And that was typical of everybody. And it turns out they were afraid of a bishop just as much as anybody else was, because they had been largely left alone by England. The Episcopal Church was technically a part of the Diocese of London, but it took 3 months to get any messages back and forth. So largely they were on their own, and they liked it. Said, yeah, Bishop of London, stay out of our business. We can run the church ourselves. So when it became clear that there might be, probably would have been, a bishop resident in Virginia, probably Virginia, maybe North Carolina, they panicked and said, we don't want that. They're going to meddle in our affairs. Right now, we're relatively autonomous. The Bishop of London leaves us alone, but if we have our own bishop here, he won't leave us alone. So the Episcopalians in the South mostly became supporters of the American Revolution. And of course, in Virginia, the heavy hitters, who were all Episcopal laypersons, and often in the vestries of the Episcopal Church, it was sort of like being on the session, became the framers of the Constitution, wrote the Declaration of Independence, and in the case of Jefferson, actually wrote the Statute of Religious Toleration for the colony of Virginia before the Revolution was even won. That was in the South. The South Episcopalians were patriots. In the North, however, it was different. In the North, the Episcopalians were a minority. In New York, Pennsylvania, New England, and they feared that if the Americans won, the Continentals, that they would be persecuted, that they would be regarded as folk who favored England, who still thought that the church and state should be one, and that church and state should be parliament, king, and bishop, and that probably Presbyterianism or Congregationalism would be established, and they would lose their civic liberties, and they'd have to support a church they didn't like. So in the North, the Episcopalians were loyalists, like almost all of them, which made a problem. Episcopalians in the South were patriots, Episcopalians in the North, loyalists. So there was a split in the church right there. And then when the Continental Army did win, most of the Episcopalians in the North got the hell out and said, this is not going to be pretty. The Presbyterians and Congregationalists have won. We're going to be persecuted. So most of them left New England and the Mid-Atlantic states and moved to Nova Scotia, which was still British, or Bermuda, which was British, and sometimes one of the Caribbean islands that were British. So Episcopalianism took a big hit in the North, not in the South, where it continued to flourish, but in the North it was almost denuded of Episcopalians. Meanwhile, the other groups were not as dramatic, but they did what was expected. The groups that were tiny and were already regarded as weird or aberrant, like the Baptists. Well, they feared an established religion more than anybody. So when somebody like Jefferson would say, how would you like absolute religious liberty with no established religions? They said, yes, that's what we've longed for forever. So almost all Baptists became supporters of the revolution. And there weren't many Methodists yet, but the ones that were largely supportive of the revolution. Lutherans, a slightly different story. Most Lutherans around here were German descended, and they had always felt that they were second-class citizens, second to Episcopalians and even Presbyterians, and therefore they were sympathetic largely to the revolution, except not all of them. Lutheranism always had a strong sense of obey the civic authorities. Luther had said that. Paul had said that. Obey the authorities, for they are ordained by God. And a lot of Lutherans took that seriously. We have to obey who's ever in charge of the government. This would also play a role in why German Lutherans were so quick to endorse Hitler. Well, he's head of the government. God says we got to obey the government, so guess we got to obey Hitler. So also here they said, well, the head of the government is George III in Parliament, so we have to obey them. So the Lutherans were sort of split. The majority party became revolutionaries, the minority party became loyalists. And when the war was over, the ones who had been loyalists, like the British, decided to get out of here. That it wouldn't be safe or happy for them having been supporters of the British. But instead of going to Nova Scotia or Bermuda, because they didn't have a place like that to go to, they went west. So they started to found little Lutheran villages in western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, and were partly responsible for the settling of what was then the West, which meant Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. Catholics had a unique response to the revolution. They thought, and these were mostly in Maryland, mostly the Carroll family, which was fantastically wealthy, decided that, well, there's always been a danger that somebody would impose a non-Catholic religion on us. We don't want that. And we're afraid that it would be Episcopalianism. So let's back the Americans, not the British, because we think that they will grant religious toleration, and that they were right. They called it correctly. So most of the Catholics became ardent supporters of the American Revolution because they saw separation of church and state. And the reason, hey, look, we're less than 1% of the population. If there's an established religion here, it's not going to be ours. And we're probably going to be persecuted. So let's have no established religion. So the Catholics threw in their cookies with the continental cause. So I mentioned this to suggest that the religious situation got very complex. And most of it revolved around, do you want an established religion, and what do you think it will be? And what's your best bet for being tolerated by whoever's in power? And whether you thought, well, our best bet is stick with Britain, they're kind of tolerant, then you'd be a loyalist. But if you went, no, we're afraid Britain's going to impose a bishop on everybody, so let's back the revolution. So denominations split, and sometimes you had weird things like North Carolina with Scotch-Irish Presbyterians shooting at Scottish Presbyterians, and vice versa. By the way, this isn't an aside. The Highland Scots in the Carolinas they tried to keep their allegiance to Great Britain and maintain their oaths. They also tried to keep everything else from Scotland, including Scotch. They became primary Scotch producers in the United States, and also bagpipes. The people who win the international bagpipe contest invariably come from North Carolina, not Scotland. Again, I'm filled with trivia. So, in addition to bagpipes and Scotch in the Carolinas, the conclusion of this is simply that one of the primary religious motivator for the American Revolution was a desire to not have an established religion. Because all the groups that were relevant feared that if there was an established religion, it wouldn't be theirs. It would be somebody else's and they'd be persecuted. So that motivated some folks to become loyalists, but most folks to become supporters of the revolution. And that fear of an established religion ran deep. I think, in my humble estimation, and I'm not an historian of the revolution, it was probably as big a mover as no taxation without representation. You could say, no bishop, no imposed religion in the interests of free responsibility for your own religious life. And that was something entirely new in the history of the world, that individuals could be entrusted with making up their own minds about how they wanted to worship or what religion they wanted to adhere to, if any. That was, nobody had tried that. It was an experiment, and I think it worked, but it's always had some opposition, and there still is, and we're still living in the aftermath of that. How much freedom of religion can the United States stand? The founding generation wanted maximal freedom. So now, what I'd like to do is just entertain questions, observations. Yeah.
Am I not correct that there's Baptist and Southern Baptist, two different things?
Yeah.
And when did that split happen, and what's the difference?
Slavery.
Makes sense.
It's the North-South thing. And that became solidified as the Civil War approached.
Okay.
So in the early days, there were just Baptists in the colonial period and the early federal period. In fact, people didn't even know if they were Baptists. There was a thin line between Baptist and Quaker. Like if you'd ask somebody, are you a Baptist? They'd probably say, I don't know. I go to church and I worship. I say, do you baptize babies? Hell no. Yeah, that meant they were Baptists. Yeah.
In the period after the American victory, before the Constitution, and even after the Constitution, there probably are examples where there were attempts to legally suppress certain religions, or do you know, state or locally?
Yeah, that never happened at the federal level
Yeah.
once the Constitution was in place. But yeah, state and locally, that did happen sometimes. Protestants were still afraid of Catholics. That was a big thing. So there were often, even in Pennsylvania, riots against Catholics in the 1790s. Some of them had odd economic dimensions to it. It was partly, should our alcoholic economy be based on Scotch or wine? Really, that was part of it. That led to the whiskey rebellion.
What do they feel about leapfrog?
Could you go into a little bit more detail on the elimination of support for the Congregational Church in New England? Did that occur before or after the Constitution was ratified?
After.
After.
Yeah, in Massachusetts, it was only disestablished in the 1830s. So it survived for almost 50 years.
Were there any legal, did it get to the Supreme Court, or
It didn't go to the Supreme Court. Because the Supreme Court kept saying that the First Amendment only disestablished religion at the federal level, not the state level, and the states can do anything they want. So if they want to have an established religion, we can't stop them. So Supreme Court kept its hands off that. The state Supreme Court did not. And that caused all kinds of problems. I mean, especially when the congregation was split and it became an issue of who owns the property. And because they were no longer an established religion by the late 1830s, it wasn't clear who could make the decision as to who owns the property, the old hardliners or the more progressive liberals. Progressive liberals became Unitarians. So yeah, locally and sometimes even county by county, there were still examples of having an established religion, and sometimes riots against other religions. And Catholics were usually regarded as fair game. So were Mennonites and Amish. That was the one ecumenical thing. Nobody liked Mennonites. I like Mennonites.
What was the name of the encounter in the Carolinas between the Highlanders and the Scotch?
I was going to look that up,
Oh.
and I forgot. It was at a bridge where the Continentals were coming to seize ammunition. You know, it was owned by the Crown, and the Highlanders tried to stop them. And that happened a few weeks before Lexington and Concord. But because it was sort of like an intra-Scottish thing, it didn't get a whole lot of attention.
Was the Jewish religion a factor in this period of time?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And there was a large Jewish population in Newport, Rhode Island, and strangely in Richmond, Virginia, and somewhat in Philadelphia. They correctly thought that their best bet to be tolerated and be fully enfranchised was to throw in their cookies with the rebellion. They thought Great Britain's a little chancy, we're not quite sure if they're going to impose a bishop, and we're not quite sure what the bishop's going to do, so let's support the Continental Army, and they did very generously. So they were the financial backers of, well, much of the Philadelphia militia. So again, it was all a question of which side do you think would be a better bet if you want your people to be enfranchised and tolerated? Yeah.
You mentioned the Lutherans, and you also mentioned the Episcopalians being linked very closely to supporting their governments. Is that part of the reason why the British wanted to, or encouraged the Hessians to be a part of their side against the colonists?
Yeah, yeah, and they were right. As you probably know, the British didn't have enough manpower to really staff an army in North America, so they subcontracted to European powers, particularly principalities in Germany, Hesse being the major one, hence we get the word Hessians. And they did so because the Germans had partly because the Germans had a reputation for being obedient, and if the ruler of Hesse said, I made a deal with the British and you are now contracted to fight for the British in North America, they'd say, well, we're good Germans, we've got to do what we're told. So you want us to go to America? We'll go to America. And they did. What was unforeseen was they got here, and many of them were captured in Pennsylvania or elsewhere and sent to Pennsylvania. And they liked it, so they never left. So when the war was over and the Hessians were released from prison, many of them just stayed and are the ancestors of a lot of the Pennsylvania Dutch around here. It was a big prisoner of war camp for Hessians in York. And very few of them went back to Germany.
In terms of denominational schisming, would you say the the establishment of religion and what you've been discussing during the Revolutionary period was less than, equal to, or more than the schisming that occurred over slavery?
That's a good question. I'm going to have to think about that. My first instinct was to say it was just as bad. But then again, those schisms were healed pretty easily. And Lutherans got back together, whether they were loyalists or patriots. Or else they just got out, like the Episcopalians. But the divisions over slavery, which were huge, I mean, every denomination split. And that led to a bloody civil war. And the schisms amongst the denominations here didn't lead to a war. That just led people to choose sides in a war that was already going on. And so that was easier to heal.
As someone who is in this world, the divisions between different religions seems to be a difference in liturgy. I mean, we all share, in large part, the Bible, and we all share a faith in a benevolent God. So are we really talking about just the order in which we do things in the service? To me here, it's like, why would you kill someone over that?
Yeah, and it's, the stuff about liturgy was a factor. But there were also deep theological and ethical differences. You know, a major one being between, say, the Moravians, the Mennonites, and the Amish on the one hand, who were pacifists, and Presbyterians on the other, who believed in just wars and were prone to participate in them. So that's a big deal. You know, are you a pacifist or not? And also, one was, do you think you need to have a conversion experience in order to be a good Christian? Or can you just be raised up in a church and never feel that you have to convert because you never felt that you were particularly bad in the first place? You know, you never played leapfrog as a child. So, and that's a big deal too. Is it nurture or is it conversion? So there were substantive issues that made people fight. I mean, the polity was sort of in the background, which was, do you want centralized authority, a hierarchy, bishops, in other words, and that meant Lutheran or Episcopalian, or do you want independent congregations that are lay-led? That meant Baptist, Congregationalist. Or do you want something in between, a kind of balance of centralization and local autonomy and lay autonomy? And that meant Presbyterian. So Presbyterians were in the middle of the road on that one. And that became a model, as I'm sure you've been told and know, of the federal government. Not a plebiscite, but a balance of powers and a balance of representation.
I'm thinking of Lafayette and his coming over to support the colonists in the revolution. I know that some of our strong governing people, like Franklin, had strong ties with France, and maybe Washington too. Is that part of the reason that Lafayette was volunteered or was asked to come over to support us?
And he did that on his own. As an armchair psychologist, I would think it was kind of adolescent rebellion on his part. He was young, he was a late teenager when he came over. He was an aristocrat, a French aristocrat, Roman Catholic. I think he just wanted to rebel against his parents against the aristocracy, against all the constraints in France. So he came over here, befriended Washington. Well, Washington befriended him, and they became close companions. And he was partly responsible for persuading Washington to not say bad things about Catholics. So especially if you want to ally with the Catholics in Canada, don't keep saying bad things about them. Like, if you want help from NATO, don't say bad things about them. And Washington did respond and forbade the celebration of Pope Day, which was where effigies of the Pope would be burned. Lafayette really genuinely liked and appreciated the American Revolution, even though he remained a devout Catholic. He even went along with the separation of church and state. That's good, maybe we could even do that in France. He was wounded, Lafayette was wounded after Washington made him a general. You know, the guy was 19. He had no military experience, but Washington made him a general. And he was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine and taken to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, to the Moravians to recover and be healed and receive medical treatment. And he really liked that. He liked that so much that he seems to have had an affair with the wife of the Moravian minister who was taking care of him, which caused a bit of a scandal and a little rupture with the Moravians. But you know, he just said, "Well, I'm French. What am I going to do?"
Just a quick follow-up. So he did not bring an army with him?
Oh, no. He just showed up kind of unannounced with some servants, got off the boat and found Washington. Franklin, who was then was an ambassador to Paris, had written to Washington saying, "There's this weird French kid who wants to come over and enlist, and he's an aristocrat, he's got a lot of money, and he's smart." So Franklin had eased the way from it. No, he brought no soldiers with him. It's one of the weirdest things in the American Revolution.
The American Revolution was how, does it depend on where you lived, whether there would be a draft or purely volunteerism?
It was purely volunteerism, but there was a lot of peer pressure. Like in the Presbyterians in Mount Joy, where they took an oath around their ancient oak tree. If you were a young man and you didn't take the oath to support the Continental Army and go join it, then you wouldn't have any friends. So there was a lot of local peer pressure, and a lot of it was associated with churches. The congregation would put pressure on folk to join one of the two armies. It was very difficult to remain neutral. Yeah.
In Ken Burns' films on the American Revolution, he spent an awful lot of time with both the issue of slavery and the Native Americans and being caught up in the revolution. Did the churches, Episcopalian in the South, Congregational in the North, did they actively participate in the debate over what to do with slavery and the Native Americans during the war?
Well, first of all, deal with slavery, because that's easier. Strangely, the folk who wanted to critique slavery and abolish it were the British. Because they offered, at least in Virginia, Governor Dunmore, the British governor, offered freedom to any slave or their families if they would desert their plantations and join the British Army. And then they finally expanded it to every slave in Virginia being emancipated. So there were a lot of African Americans who enlisted in the British Army. Meanwhile, that frightened everybody else in the colonies, so they They didn't talk about emancipation of slavery. Said, no, if we emancipate the slaves, look what they're doing. They're joining the British Army. In fact, it led them to step up their suppression of any slave organization. Native Americans, that's more complex, and it went sort of region by region. I hate to tell you this, but in Pennsylvania, it became sort of a dispute between the Moravians, who were very sympathetic to Native Americans and had converted many of them to Moravianism, and the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, who in Pennsylvania had memories of Indian attacks and therefore were very suspicious and hostile to any Native American, and usually didn't discriminate as to whether a particular tribe had been converted to Christianity, was sympathetic to the revolution, or were still not Christian at all, or had converted to Catholicism and were in the pay of the British. So it was Moravians saying, let's be nice to the Native Americans, let's not hurt them. And Scotch-Irish saying, you can't trust Native Americans. We've got to defend ourselves against them. And that also led to a couple of massacres of Native Americans. Yeah.
Are you aware of any state or colony or county that adopted the draft during the Revolutionary War to draft a regiment from their region? And did they pay them? Or was it the pay only come from the federal or the higher level?